Carving demonstration. Permanent maxillary right first premolar. For carving the 3 times the natural size, a 9-inch wax block is used. Measure 9 cm from the end of the block using a metal scale and mark on the wax block with a carver. Then draw lines parallel to the edge of the block on all the 4 surfaces exactly at the same measurement. This 9 cm wax block is used for carving this tooth. From one end of the wax block, measure 26 mm using the metal scale and mark it using the wax carver. Then draw lines parallel to the edge of the block on all the 4 surfaces exactly at the same measurement. This line corresponds to the cervical line of the tooth. The 26 mm part of the wax block is used for carving the crown part and the remaining part is used for carving the root. After demarcating the crown and the root, the individual surfaces are labelled on the root part of the wax block. This is the buccal view, mesial view, palatal view and the distal view. For carving the occlusal surface, draw the hexagonal occlusal outline on the occlusal part of the wax block. When drawing the occlusal outline, it should be such that the buccal part should be brought mesiodistally and the palatal part should be 4 mm shorter than the buccal part. This is the marked occlusal outline. Next, the occlusal outline of the crown is carved by removing the wax from the sides exactly up to the marked level. This shape or outline should extend from the occlusal surface up to the cervical area. This shows the carved hexagonal occlusal outline of the crown. To carve the mesial and the distal cuspal slopes of the buccal and the palatal cusp, 2 lines are drawn on the occlusal third of the buccal and the palatal surface, extending from a point midway mesiodistally and ending up to the mesial and the distal outlines exactly at the junction of middle and occlusal third. Another line should be drawn on the occlusal surface joining the center point of the cuspal slopes on the buccal and the palatal aspect. Next, draw the proximal outlines on the buccal and palatal aspect of the crown. On the buccal surface, draw the proximal outline starting from the middle third of the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal edge up to the cervical line to about 0.5 mm short of the edge of the block. Similarly, on the palatal surface, draw the proximal outline starting from the middle third of the mesiopalatal and the distal palatal edge up to the cervical line to about 1 mm short of the edge of the block. The mesial cuspal slope should be long and the distal cuspal slope should be short. This is the buccal and the palatal aspects showing the cuspal and the proximal outlines. Now, the cuspal slopes are carved by removing the wax near the occlusal third by following the cuspal outlines. This shows the carved cuspal slope on one side. Next, the wax should be removed similarly on the other side. This shows the carved cuspal slopes on the buccal, palatal and occlusal aspects. Now, carve the proximal aspect by slowly removing the wax on the mesial surface starting from the mesiobuccal edge and moving towards the mesiopalatal edge. Next, the distal surface is carved by slowly removing the wax from the distal buccal edge and moving towards the distopalatal edge. The carving of the proximal aspect is otherwise called as a proximal reduction, and this should follow the mesial and the distal outlines drawn on the buccal and the palatal aspects. This shows the carved proximal surfaces. To carve the cusp and the grooves, the occlusal outline is drawn on the occlusal surface. This is the occlusal aspect showing the cuspal and the groove outlines. First, carve the buccal cusp by removing the wax from the mesiobuccal edge towards the occlusal surface up to the line marked as the central groove to a depth of about 4 mm. Similarly, carve the distobuccal cuspal slope. This is the occlusal aspect showing the carved buccal cusp. Similarly, carve the palatal cusp by carving the mesiopalatal and the distopalatal cuspal slopes. This is the occlusal aspect showing the carved buccal and palatal cusps. Then the triangular fossa is carved by removing the wax in the triangular fossa area. It should be removed in such a way that the marginal ridges are made prominent. Now, define or deepen the grooves on the occlusal aspect. This shows the carved occlusal aspect with the buccal cusp, palatal cusp, triangular fossae, developmental grooves and the marginal ridges. Now, the occlusal convergence is given by rounding the occlusal surfaces on all the sides. This shows the occlusal convergence. Next, draw the mesial and the distal outline of the root on the buccal aspect of the root part. Similarly, the mesial and the distal outlines are drawn on the palatal aspect. But this outline should be 0.5 mm less than the buccal aspect. This 0.5 mm difference corresponds to the palatal convergence of the root. This is the buccal, mesial, palatal and distal aspects showing the root outlines. Now the proximal surface of the root is carved by slowly removing the wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. This is how a completed proximal root outline should be on one side. Next, the other proximal surface of the root is carved in a similar way by slowly removing the wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. When carving the proximal outline of the root, the carving should follow the outlines drawn previously on the buccal and the palatal aspects. This is the buccal and the palatal aspects showing the carved proximal outlines of the root. Next, draw the buccal and the palatal root outlines on the mesial and the distal aspect of the root part. This is the mesial and the distal aspects showing the buccal and the palatal root outlines. Now, the bifurcation is carved by removing the wax from the furcation area near the apical third. This shows the bifurcation near the apical third of the root. Then, by following the buccal and the palatal root outlines, the buccal and the palatal roots are carved. This is the mesial, showing the carved buccal and palatal roots. Lastly, define the furcation area of the buccal and the palatal roots. This shows the carved buccal and palatal roots. Next, the cervical line is drawn on the buccal, distal, palatal and the mesial aspect. This is how the cervical line should be drawn on all the aspects of the carved tooth. Then, the cervical constriction is carved by slowly removing the wax from the crown towards the marked cervical line. This is done on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. This is the buccal, mesial, palatal and distal aspects showing the partly carved cervical constriction. Next, the cervical constriction is carved by slowly removing the wax from the root towards the marked cervical line. This is also done on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. After carving this cervical constriction, the root part should be smoothened to remove any excess elevations. This is the buccal, mesial, palatal and distal aspect showing the carved cervical constriction. Then, carve the mesial marginal groove on the mesial marginal ridge starting from the mesial pit up to the mesial marginal ridge and extending onto the mesial surface to about 2 mm. The mesial developmental depression is carved in the cervical third of the mesial aspect of the crown and also in the mesial side of the mesial root, in the middle and the cervical third extending up to the bifurcation. Preliminary polishing is done using the rough polishing cloth by rubbing gently on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. Then, the yellow polishing cloth is used for polishing by rubbing gently on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. While using these polishing cloths, forceful rubbing should be avoided to prevent any changes in the contours of the carved tooth. Final polishing is done using either a cotton or a tissue paper dipped in soap water. After polishing in soap water, the carved tooth is dried using a tissue paper. This is the final buccal aspect, mesial aspect, palatal aspect, distal aspect and occlusal aspect of the permanent maxillary right first premolar. This shows the different stages of tooth carving up to the completed tooth.